We're going to go into strength training specific for the hammer throw, and we're going to start right now. What's up, everybody? It's Dane Miller from throwsuniversity.com. And if this is your first time to the channel and you're interested in becoming a better thrower, you want to be more technical, you want to become more explosive, you want to drop big bombs, make sure that you like, you subscribe, and you ring that notification bell so we can help you become a champion. So there's a lot of question marks around the sport of the hammer throw. There's a lot of question marks around whether you need to lift heavy, whether you need to lift light, and what you should actually do to try and improve your distances when we're talking about the hammer throw. And if we can think about it, the hammer throw is going to involve throwing a 16-pound ball or a 4-kilo ball if you're a female, or if we're in high school and we're lucky enough, we're going to be throwing a 12-pound ball if we're male, 4 kilo if we're female. And if we can think about that, 1 wind, 2 winds, and then you're going to do 3 to 4 turns as you move through the circle. And breaking down the throw is really, really important. So when we hit those 2 winds and we get 3 or 4 turns, we've got to look at it for what it is. We've got to see those forces that are being developed. We got to look at the mobility that we need, and we have to see the different positions. Fortunately, I was able to spend a lot of time with 1972 Olympic champion, 1976 Olympic bronze medalist, and one of the best hammer coaches in the history of the sport, Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk. I trained under Dr. B for just around a year from 2007 to 2008. And I spent a lot of time picking his brain, going over to his house, bothering him while he was taking his naps, and trying to figure out what all the details were behind the hammer throw, behind the shot put, behind the discus, even behind the javelin. And a lot of the knowledge that he had was from his experience coaching Yuri Tam, Yuri Sadiq, some of the best hammer throwers ever, world record holders, Olympic champions. And some of the key aspects came back to being capable of putting out a large amount of force in a repetitive motion. So being strong was very, very important. Being technical was even more important. And then being able to be strong and hold your technique was obviously the most important aspect. So a lot of the different work that they would do was in the circle. A lot of the work was around special strength, but a lot of it was around some of the stuff that they would be doing in the weight room. And that's where we're gonna head. We're gonna go into those 4 or 5 key factors that you need to become an elite hammer thrower. So to start off, when you're executing the hammer throw, you're going to hit those 3 or 4 turns, and you're going to do them through a very dynamic process. So you have to have dynamic strength. You have to be explosive. You have to be able to absorb energy and then reuse it in a positive manner so that you can make progress through the circle, so that you can accelerate the ball. And that's the key factor when we're talking about dynamic strength. So that might be doing high pulls into a power snatch. And that's one key factor here. When Dr. B would talk to me, he would say, you know, a lot of the stuff that they would do with Sadiq, he might only do high pulls with 110 or 120 or 130 kilos, but he was capable from that dynamic perspective of putting out close to 170 kilos when he would do a power clean if they wanted to go heavy, but they rarely would actually go heavy. And this is something as well that if you've been around someone like one of the best in the US, Rudy Winkler, he's thrown 80 plus meters in the hammer. He's one of the best hammer throwers to ever come out of the United States. And you can see him when he's in the weight room. He's doing repetitive high pulls, and he might do that with 140, 150 kilos. And that's one of the big factors behind a lot of these guys. If you can think about the contemporaries in the US who are really, really good right now. Okay, Rudy is phenomenal, right? He's one of the best ever coming out of the US. Then you think about Connor McCullough, Danny Ho, you got Alex Young, you got Sean Donnelly, all these guys. And when you start to get around them, what you start to see is they can do repetitive work through an explosive fashion. They're extremely dynamic athletes. They are phenomenal athletes, but they're also really dynamic. And that sort of leads us into that next aspect. And I almost would like to lump these two together. I think it's really important to acknowledge that from an absolute strength perspective, it is very important to be strong. You know, Dr. B would even mention Litvinov, Yuri Tam, and Igor Nikulin, who was another Russian hammer thrower. These were guys who were extremely strong. very, very strong from a traditional perspective. Could back squat 270, 290 kilos, Yuri Tam, just an absolute freak of nature. And what would end up happening is he would mention that the stronger you could get, or at least the strength that you would get to a point of diminishing returns, once you would hit that point of diminishing returns, the big payback was that you would hold dynamic trunk control. And if you could hold that trunk control, if you would have core strength or ab strength, he wouldn't use those terms, dynamic trunk control, but he would reference having a very strong trunk. When you would do things like a back squat or a front squat, those movements would pay off because it would help you improve your trunk stability, your trunk control. And when you can improve your trunk control, you become a little bit more rigid and you can get the ball to accelerate more effectively because the energy is going into the ball instead of losing it on a side-to-side basis or whatever it might be. And that's something that I want to touch on with these contemporary American guys. When you're around them, it's not that they're these big hulking throwers, but there's something about them where you just see it. You know, their stomach is extremely thick, their back is very thick, they've got big glutes, and that's the one big factor that is very similar with all these guys. You get around somebody like Alex Young and his back looks like a billboard. Same with Rudy. They're just super, super thick throwers. And I believe that comes from a lot of that dynamic strength. It comes from a lot of that absolute strength work, although they get to a point where they don't need to get super, super strong anymore. And it also comes from that trunk control. So you're gonna need a lot of rotational strength. You're gonna need a lot of rotational movement. You're gonna need a lot of exercises that are really gonna trigger growth in your abs that you can then utilize to coordinate through a dynamic perspective. So all these things sort of come hand in hand. And that takes us as well into the mobility work. And some of the big things that Dr. B would do from a mobility perspective that I would notice is they do a lot of jump lunges to help with the groin. They do some Cossack squats. But a unique exercise that I would see on a consistent basis that brought in that dynamic strength, it brought in some trunk control work, and then it also triggered that mobility work, is he would have athletes do a high pull with a closer grip. So 1, 2, 3, and then on the fourth one, it would be a close grip snatch. Okay, so close grip snatch into that big finish. And that long pull is going to help with that dynamic strength. It's gonna help be explosive. And on top of that, on the eccentric load, you have to have some trunk control. And then finally, you have to, on the catch, have really good thoracic extension. So that's where mobility can come into play. You've gotta have very mobile hips. You've gotta have really mobile ankles to handle what you're doing as you're working through the circle. And I do also believe that this is where there can be some upper body work. I remember Dr. B mentioning and comparing hammer throwers to speed skaters, that they should do some upper body work, not a ton, but enough so that if they're going to front squat or they're going to back squat, they're going to do step ups, whatever it might be, their shoulders would not get banged up from having a large load on their back or on their front position. So it is important to do a little bit of that upper body work just to try and stabilize the shoulders, to stabilize even the lats to a point, so that as they work through all these positions, they can handle that load, and then also so that they can improve their mobility, because this is a key factor as well. If we can think about mobility in the upper body, mobility in the abs, mobility in the hips, the longer we can lengthen our arms based off of how lengthened our lats are. In theory, if our lats are a little bit more mobile, that's actually going to increase the length of the hammer. So we've got to look at it from that perspective. And then finally, it's really important, especially in the hammer throw, that you have some special strength movements that you can transfer really well over to the actual competitive movement. This might be hammer finishes into a release where maybe you do 2 winds and you release. You can see some of the Hungarian throwers from back in the 90s and early 2000s doing really heavy hammer rotations, really heavy hammer winds. There's some footage of these guys doing winds with 100 pounds. Bela's Kish doing winds with 100 pounds, rotating around his upper body, trying to really mobilize his lats so that when he's winding, he can get a nice stretch across his trunk, he can get a nice stretch into his lats, and he can get that nice wind to get the ball moving. And so those are all really important factors. Those are really important movements for special strength. I actually believe too that a movement you can utilize that I've seen Dr. B use with his hammer throwers is even doing side med ball throws into a wall and trying to do that repeatedly so that when the ball would come back, you have to absorb, you have to have dynamic trunk control, and that's also going to lead to that dynamic strength. So all 5 of these factor into really good programming. You've got to have that dynamic work. You have to have absolute strength. It's important to train and recognize dynamic trunk control and then mobility and special strength all pieced together into this complex puzzle that involves the strength training for the hammer throw. So if you need help based on your programming and help in periodization, we have an elite hammer strength program that we've put together where we factor in all of these different concepts. We've put it together in a program. You can click on the link down below in the description. When you click on that link, you're going to head over to throwsuniversity.com and you can pick up our elite hammer strength program to help you make those hammer throw gains. If you want more content about hammer throw based training or videos about the hammer throw, click on this card right here. Until next time, guys, peace.